So here we are then, picking up from where we left off in the last video sequence. Now we looked at this area here, didn't we? Where we'd set up our AOVs in there. So that was our set that we'd gone for. Now one of the things that I didn't stress to you was the importance of the data, the driver and the filter that you're using in there. I would go for the following setup. RGB across the board there. Ignore the Z1 because that needs to be set as is there, which is fine, but everything else is RGB, EXR driver format and the Gaussian filter. Everything else is as that, but you can see everything laid out there. Okay, now the thing that we didn't get, of course, was the what we call the ambient occlusion. Now ambient occlusion is something that's worth showing you an example of. So this would be the ambient occlusion for this 3D vehicle here, and there's a further one, and there are many more there. I've just done a Google image search for these. But the idea of these is that the ambient occlusion gives an image which is essentially just grayscale. So the darker areas are the areas which represent the components of the vehicle or whatever it is you might be building, which have had their ambient light occluded. So something has slightly gotten in the way of that. So a good example of that will be around the tyre tread, around the little wheel arches. You can see that the natural light, the ambient light, can't quite reach those. Similarly, underneath here, there's a little bit of shadow in there, but it's actually it's the occlusion of light getting through there. Now, one of the important things to remember about ambient occlusion is it's actually relatively light independent. You don't even need to necessarily put a light into your scene, so it doesn't really matter where the light source is. You should get a similar sort of look to your ambient occlusion. So that's what we want to have for our vehicle. So we'll just minimize that. We'll go back to our setup here. Now, ambient occlusion is not something that we can very readily get from in here. Okay, so we're going to use a different setup for that. So I want to put that to one side, so I'll just minimize that. I'll keep this open so you can see what's going on as I do this. Now for this one, we need to go into Windows, Rendering, because we're looking at rendering, Render Settings, and that will give us this window here. I've obviously gone into the wrong one because that's not the one I'm after. Let me just try again. Windows, Rendering, and render setup, not settings, because that is of course render settings. So that's obviously a mistake that I had to make just to prove the point. So it's render setup. There we go. Okay, so that's the menu that I'm looking for in here. So if you look in here, what we've got a series of elements which are already set up for our render. Now what we want to do is set up a brand new render setup element, and we're going to click on here. This is to create a render layer. So we're now dealing with separate layers of render, which won't impact on this directly. We can still have this all set up with all our AOV set up, but we're going to have a separate render layer. So we're going to add that one. This is going to be our AO or ambient occlusion layer. We're going to right click on that. We don't actually need to do anything with that, it's just a named layer. We're going to right click. We're going to create a collection. Now the collection is just saying the collection of assets within your scene which are going to be using our ambient occlusion layer, using this render layer. So this layer will render the following things in the collection. So I'm going to say AO and I want to put collection. So I know it's my collection of things. Now what we need to do with this one is add some elements in here. I find it easier just to go into our outliner here. Now I happen to know that my car is the Audi R8 layer there, and I also know that the P plane 2 there is my ground plane, so I'm going to hold down control and select that one. Let me just try that again. So hold down shift. It doesn't seem to want to do. I'll do one at a time anyway. So middle mouse button, drag across to add that into our layer here. Let me just try again. There we have done that. And then this one, same again, middle mouse button and drag across. So these have now been added to our layer. So effectively what we're saying is just those two elements, the entire car and the ground plane, will be included in our ambient occlusion collection. Okay, so next thing, we'll right click. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. We'll just delete that one out. That was an accident. I've done it again. There we are. So we've got our collection there. Right click and hold down. And then what we want to do is override the shader that has been used in this render. So it's a shader override. We'll right click. We can leave that set to shader override. I'm kind of okay with that. We'll select it, and this is the first time really we're going to do much editing in here. If you look there, sometimes this will open up a bit like this and you can't quite see this right hand side. If that's the case, just pull it out so we can get to this bit. We're going to Click in there, and we're going to add a shader, which is going to be an override shader. So we're going to go into Arnold, shader, surface shader, and the one that says AI Ambient Occlusion. Okay, so we've got that in here now. Okay, so you'll see in here it makes no difference. Now the reason being is that currently this render is turned on, the current render set. We don't want that one, we want to try out the ambient occlusion render. So we'll click on this one, this little eye, and that will do the following thing. So you can see that's given us now our ambient occlusion. If you look at this, I'm just going to zoom in a little. I'm still only set at 50% here, but you can see it's actually quite bleached out. Very, very light, very bleached out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to minimize this. To go into the settings for this, because it is like a material, it's a shader, it's got the same sort of settings. If I click on any component of my car now, which I've just done there for the bonnet, it should automatically open me up in the attribute editor, like the lighting, the hood shape, and also ambient occlusion. Okay, so I can now go in and play around with the ambient occlusion. Now, this is a global setting, so it's not just specific to that bonnet of the car. I could have clicked the tyre or the number plate or the ground plane, and I would have still got these same settings. It's a global setting across all of those things. And what we can do is we can have a look at kind of clipping the near and the far, or adjusting the black and the white. Now, if I clip the near, it actually bleaches it out even further. If I clip the far, we can do that kind of thing. We'll actually start to get a little bit more definition in certain areas. I prefer to work with the near and far. Kind of works for me, but it doesn't really matter. We could have gone back to where that was roughly 100, and we could have kind of clipped other areas instead using the black or the white. I prefer to keep that set to white and then clip this, because then it just seems, well, it seems to make more sense to me, but you decide which works for you. Now, essentially what I'm looking at is having nothing too bleached out, and having the reasonably dark blacks, but reasonably light whites, but not bleached out as it was before. So I'm going to keep that sort of setting. So I've gone for about 743. We'll just call it 740. I'll key that in, 740, and that will do. I don't really need to do much more there. I've got things like spread. If I reduce that, you'll see it'll just kind of darken off areas. So it's not spreading out, it's not kind of fading or out, that kind of spread of the ambient occlusion. So I like to keep that at maximum, so I've got a nice broad spread, a fall off of the light. The samples is just how processed it is. The higher the number, the better the quality. So it's kind of a quality setting. 3 really is plenty here. So we've got our ambient occlusion set up. Okay, so that will have to be exported out as a separate image for now. There are other ways of doing it all automated, but to save a lot of bother for now, we're just going to export that out as a separate image. Okay, so let's go and minimize this. Now, I just closed down, I think earlier on, in my Windows render setup. I minimized it, but it went off screen, so I couldn't have got at it. So just to show you that I can always go back to my original render by doing that. Little eye, or I can do that, and it will go back to this render. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at how we can maybe add another one of these, and then we'll take it from there.